folks, and welcome to Anatomy and Physiology Lab on Demand. Today we are going to learn the structures related to the integumentary system. So everybody say that word, integumentary. And so we are going to look at models of the skin. And there are various different models. I'm going to be using only a couple of the models over and over again. So make sure you look at the structures on the pictures of the other model as well as the model I'm demonstrating it on. So starting off first, cannot get it to, there we are. We're going to talk about the superficial portion of the skin, and that is known as the epidermis. So if you remember your prefixes, you'll remember that epi means something that's on something else. So the epidermis is on the dermis. And when we look at the epidermis, right up here, what you're looking to find is to find the little squiggly line, which is the separating. It's the lowest part of the epidermis. And in fact, the epidermis will either have 4 or 5 layers. When you listen to the lecture talk at integumentary system later on, it'll make a little bit more sense. So let's start with the deepest layer of the epidermis. So you're looking for the cells which are forming the lowest part, the deepest part of that squiggly line. The deepest part of the epidermis is 1 cell layer thin, and this is known as the stratum basale, or the basal layer. But you can't write basal layer, you need to write stratum basale. Going superficial to the stratum basale, you can tell it's a different layer because they have changed the coloration of the cells on the model. And this layer is multiple layers thick. 3 to 10 different cell layers thick, and this is known as the stratum spinosum. Continuing in a superficial manner, the next layer always appears as a darker layer on models because it's darker in real histology. And it's once again going to be a thin layer, usually about 3 cells thick, and that is known as the stratum granulosum. The next layer is an optional layer. And that optional layer is known as the stratum lucidum, which means something is clear, it's lucid. So it's usually a white or a light color. And if you look at this model, you can see that there's a stratum lucidum on the part on the right that I'm pointing to. And on the left, there is no stratum lucidum. And then the 5th and final layer, the most superficial layer, totally varies in thickness. This is known as the stratum corneum, and in some places in your body, it can be quite thin, only 3 to 5 cell layers thick, whereas other areas, it's quite thick. So, you know, when you go barefoot in the summer and your heel gets really thick skin back there that you can like almost scrape off, that's the stratum corneum that's getting really thick. So this is a real protective layer. And so that brings us to talking about comparing these two things. In this model, this one you can tell is thicker than this, but that's not how we tell the difference between thick and thin skin. If it contains that 4th layer, that stratum lucidum, so it would have 5 layers of skin, that's thick skin. If it only has 4 layers to the epidermis, sorry, I meant to say 5 layers of the epidermis. If it only has 4 layers to the epidermis, then that is thin skin. So it has nothing to do with how thick or thin the stratum corneum is. It has to do with whether or not this layer is present, the stratum lucidum. Okay. Now, when we look at these 5 layers of the epidermis, there are 4 different cell types, but on the models that we have, you only can see the 1 cell type that accounts for about 99% of all the cells. And that cell is called a keratinocyte. So as you recall, that suffix cyte means cell. So what this means is a cell that makes keratin. And that's exactly what these cells are doing. So it doesn't matter if I'm pointing to a cell in any of these layers. If I'm pointing to a cell, the only cell that you can see on the model is a keratinocyte. Okay. When it comes to lecture, we'll be talking about the other 3 types of cell and how you tell them from each other. Okay. So that's it for the epidermis with its 5 layers. Now, the second part of the skin is known as the dermis, and as you can see, the dermis is much thicker than the epidermis. But the dermis itself is divided into 2 different layers. The more superficial part of the dermis contains a lot of blood vessels, okay? And it's this upper area of the dermis is called the papillary dermis. And in the papillary dermis, the interface between the papillary dermis and the epidermis is not a straight line, but it's more like an egg crate shell. It's going up and down and up and down and up and down areas. And in fact, in the dermis, this upward projection of the dermis is called a dermal papilla. Okay, so students sometimes get confused and they think that the downward projection of the epidermis is the dermal papillus, and it's not the downward projection of the epidermis. It's the upward projection of the dermis. That's why it's called a dermal papilla. Okay. So the dermal papilla is part of the layer papillary dermis. That's where that word came from. Papillary is the adjective form, papilla is the noun form. All right. So backing up and looking at the skin as a whole, this bracket is now showing the part of the dermis that is not papillary dermis. This is papillary dermis up here with all the blood vessels. Yes, there are still blood vessels in this deeper part, but there's lots and lots of collagen fibers, and this part of the dermis is called the reticular dermis. Okay. So 2 layers to the skin, the epidermis with its 5 layers, and the dermis with its 2 layers. Okay. Deep to the skin is a layer of tissue known as the hypodermis, meaning underneath the dermis. This is also known as subcutaneous layer. Cutaneous means skin, sub means below, so this means below the skin. Okay, so the hypodermis is not a layer of skin. Skin has 2 layers, dermis and epidermis. Hypodermis is deep to it. Okay. So the bracketed area is showing the hypodermis, and you know you're in the hypodermis when you start seeing a lot of these yellowish globules, because what we have a lot of in the hypodermis is adipose tissue. So that's it for the layers of the integument. So let's look at some structures. So I think you all recognize this black thing as a hair, okay? And surrounding every single hair in your body is a gland that's very blobby, okay? And this blob gland secretes an oily substance which coats the surface of the hair. And this gland is called a sebaceous gland. The substance it secretes, as you'll learn in the lecture, is known as sebum. But sebaceous gland is the term for lab. Now, in addition to these oil-producing glands, we have sweat glands. And what you should notice about sweat glands is they are not blobs. Instead, they are tubes that are all coiled up. Okay, so here's a different model of skin. Okay, and on this one, you can clearly see this blob here next to that hair. That would be a sebaceous gland. But on this one, you can clearly see a tube that's all coiled up, and over here we have another tube that's all coiled up. So these are going to be sweat glands. And so we have two different types of sweat glands. One type of sweat gland, the duct goes all the way to the surface of the skin. Excuse me. And the other type of sweat gland, the duct opens to the hair. So the type of sweat gland where the duct is opening to the hair is called an apocrine sweat gland. Whereas the type of sweat gland that is opening to the surface of the skin is called an eccrine sweat gland. And I will be talking about what the differences of these two and the differences in location in the lecture part. But for lab, you just have to be able to identify an apocrine sweat gland from an eccrine sweat gland. So 3 different types of glands for you to identify. Sebaceous gland, which opens around the hair. Apocrine sweat gland, which is a tubular gland, which opens around the hair. And eccrine sweat gland, which is a tubular gland, which opens to the surface of the skin. So let's talk about the hair for a second. When we look at a hair, the part of the hair that is visible outside the skin is called the hair shaft. So all of this is hair shaft. And then the part of the hair, that is deep to the skin. So starting right here at the stratum corneum and going deep, all of that is called the hair root. If we look at the hair root, the deepest part of the hair root is swollen. It's wider than the thickness of the hair, and that is called the bulb of the hair root. Okay. So hair shaft externally, hair root in your skin, the deepest part is the bulb of the hair root. If you look at the bulb of the hair root way down deep, you will see that there are little blood vessels which are going in, bringing nutrition from and taking waste out of the bulb of the hair root. And this is called the hair papilla. So the hair papilla is actually not a hair structure. It is a structure that goes inside the bulb of the hair root. And so it has blood vessels, it has a little areolar connective tissue, it has a little this, a little bit of that. Okay. The next structure, I want to start way up here at the epidermis and find the deepest layer of the epidermis, that stratum basale. And I want you to follow and see what happens to the epidermis when it reaches a hair. What happens is it travels and it completely surrounds the hair. So if this is the hair and here is the epidermis, when it gets to the hair, it actually goes down, around, comes back up and goes there. So it's completely ensheathing the hair. And the part of the epidermis that surrounds the hair root is called the hair follicle. Okay. So all these arrows are showing hair follicle. This would be hair follicle up here as well. And another thing to notice about the hair is every single hair in your body has its own private little muscle. That muscle is called the arrector pili muscle. And when that muscle contracts, it has that hair, instead of leaning over, has it stand up. And that's what happens when you have goosebumps. So with that, we are done with structures related to the hair. We are done with the glands. We're done with the layers of the skin. And all we have left now, I think, yes, are going to be the sensory receptors in the skin. So there are multiple sensory receptors, but there's only some of them you can see on the model. So the first one is actually just a nerve, and that nerve has little endings which can go into the dermis or they can go in the epidermis. And because this is showing them in the epidermis, they're called free nerve endings of the epidermis. If we had had a picture showing them ending in the dermis, they would have been called free nerve endings of the dermis. So make sure you give the location as well as just free nerve ending. The second one you find by looking at the bulb of the hair root. And at the bulb of the hair root, you will see nerves which are surrounding them. And in fact, there's more than one nerve that goes there. And so this is called a plexus. So the name of this plexus is the hair root plexus, which makes sense because that's exactly where you would find it. For the third structure, I need you to go back to the papillary dermis, specifically look in the dermal papilla. And in some of the dermal papilla, you will find something that kind of looks like the cotton part of a Q-tip, which has a little nerve thing attached to it. And this is called a Meissner's corpuscle, as an alternate name of tactile corpuscle. So you can use either name. I think your textbook is using Meissner's corpuscle. And the last structure will only be found in the deep dermis or in the hypodermis. And when you look at it, it looks like an oval onion that's been cut in half so you can see layers of it. And this is called a Pacinian corpuscle. And with that, we are done. Yes. With structures of the integumentary system. So I want to thank you, and I will see you again in class. And don't forget to, once you have studied this, to do the APR for this.